Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And on today's episode, I am going to be joined by Lee Rector. He is the CEO at Embassy Data Logistics. And Lee is bringing a lot of experience in the warehousing world to the show today. We're going to talk about that experience, his background, how he came to found this company, Embassy Data Logistics, what they're doing around data within the warehouse, and their warehouse command product. We're also going to touch on his book, which is called Warehousing 101, a reference guide to the warehouse, which is very interesting. I started reading. It's a very detailed and deep dive into some of the basics and references that I think every warehouse operator should know. So we're going to get some of that knowledge today on the show. So Lee, welcome to the show. How are you?
Very good, Kevin. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Great to have you on here. Great to connect with you. So, why don't we kind of dive into your background a little bit? You've been involved in the warehousing world for quite some time, which I read about in your book here. So you have definitely some knowledge to impart on us today, I believe. So why don't you kind of tell us a little bit about your background and how you've gotten to the point you're at now, where you founded this company, Embassy Data Logistics.
Sure. So we won't go back to the very beginning, but let's talk about 25 years ago. I got into the supply chain game from a technology perspective.
Mm,
I've been in the technology industry for over 30 years, and I saw we'll call it the opportunity in the industry back in 2000.
mm,
Got involved with a company that was actually writing WMS, warehouse management systems.
okay.
We ran that company for 3 years, took it public, exited that company in 2003, and really focused then at the time on building optimization solutions. So rather than execution level software, we looked at improving operations using tools and data sets. And we ran that company for 15 years. My partner and we then exited that company in 2018. Over those 15 years, we did projects with over 600 companies in
Mm,
40 countries. Uh, at the time, I think I was counting maybe 61 of the Fortune 100 companies on the
mm,
planet. We were doing not only management consulting for them, but supply chain consulting specifically,
mm,
operational planning, and really focusing in on the warehouse and transportation side. In 2018, when we exited that company, I got back into the company that acquired our organization, Gartner Magic Quadrant WMS company.
okay.
We actually brought that company into the North American market space during COVID, which was a challenging time for everybody. We stood up over 40 warehouses with that solution
Oh, wow.
until we exited that company in 2021. In 2021, I took some time away, stepped back, really decided where I wanted to go. Uh, with, I guess we'll talk about my experience and what I'd seen in the market.
Yeah.
Um, and there was a software that for years I'd wanting to build and bring it to market as a low cost solution.
Mm,
So I embarked on building some software at that time. Uh, Over the period of say 15 months or so, and as you mentioned, I wrote the book at the same time, and it all stems, I guess, from my experience of working with operations around the globe, and really the majority of my work started with educating, whether it was the operator, the executive, and being able to speak both to the executive level, which usually talks in dollars, and
mm,
versus the warehouse, which talks in touches and units. And
right.
there is a very large gap between those two languages, so to speak. So we
Mm,
always spent a lot of time connecting the dots for the executives and then explaining to the operations about, we'll call it the science of warehousing. You know, traditionally we're talking about people that run warehouses as sort of management by walking around, and our model had always been let the data drive the solution. Um, and so building solutions around the data was always, we'll call it filling the gap. And what I wanted to do was build a technology that allowed very quickly to take simple data and create manageable solutions. So that's kind of where we got to and how I got to where I am right now.
Gotcha. Very interesting, and obviously a ton of experience there, in working with those different systems, and like you said, being in so many different warehouses, operations, and seeing how they operate, and some of the gaps there as well to lead you to founding this Embassy Data Logistics. So if we look at Embassy Data Logistics itself, I mean, I guess give us you kind of alluded there to what you wanted to do. Kind of tell us maybe the brief overview of what it is that you guys actually do, and what is that problem that you're really focused in on and solving.
Oh, great. So, Embassy, as I said, was kind of like my brainchild that
Mm,
I started with. It's my baby. And really, what I wanted to do was build software technology that's easily implementable across the board. And what I mean by that is it's generalized to the point where we build a technology or an application where it could be used in automotive,
mm,
retail, pharmaceutical. It doesn't really matter the industry, and it can run in essentially any country on the planet. And how we did that is we took, I'll say, years of experience, but more importantly, assembling data
mm,
over that 20 plus or 25 plus years, and building up tables, and we'll call them lookup tables, for all the touch points inside a building. And what I wanted to do was build software that allowed me to uh, quickly take simple data, uh, orders, SKU characteristics, number of
mm,
people in the building, where else, and then using, we'll call it, engineered averages across hundreds of elements inside of a business. We could then answer the question that's out there on the market that every customer I've ever dealt with has asked me. And they ask, what is the average for my business? Right?
mm.
Doesn't matter what it is, whether
Yeah.
it's grocery. They want to, well, what's the average? Are we doing good or are we doing bad? And every WMS system, every technology out there measures things called activity.
Mm,
So if I'm doing 44 cases an hour, I don't really know if that's good or bad, but I know I'm doing 44 cases an hour per person. And what
right.
I wanted to do was build a solution that said, well, at 44 cases an hour, you're about 80% of the
Mm,
standard, or you're at 70% of the standard, and use this to base everything that we do with regards to our labor inside the building. So we took the attack of approaching labor from a tool set rather than from an enterprise type solution. So we didn't want to have a solution that required engineering labor, we'll call it services. And we
mm,
didn't want to have integrations to WMSs, which then eliminates 98% of those customers on the market that actually need this. So I wanted to build a tool that was easily implementable, didn't require a lot of services. The cost was, we priced it for the upcoming market. So, in other
mm,
words, tier three marketplaces, the ever expanding global marketplace. So, whether I was in Mexico, Brazil, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, they could afford the same solution. So, really, the plan was to level the playing field.
mm,
So, at our solution was to give everybody this engineering at the cost, and it's a simple, low cost solution for them that allows them to measure productivity, benchmark their operation, then use those two factors to if I'm a 3PL, do costing at
mm,
32 touch points of labor inside the building. Or I could look at what is the net effect of if I add automation to my business? How does that affect my labor? And then
right.
finally, with inside of my operation, I can easily find areas of opportunity that maybe I'm not performing at. So if you're at 80% of the work standard inside of your building, and at 80% of the work standard, it says you only need 4 people in receiving, but you have 7 people working in receiving, or you have 56 hours a day in
Yeah.
receiving, you then know that they're working at a significantly lower rate
Right.
than everybody else in the building. And so simple models like this allow you to do that. Traditionally, that was a 7 6 figure application that took 8,
Right.
12, 20 weeks to get up and running.
Hmm.
And really, what that was that you had to have an engineer to come in and look at your operation. They do a time and motion study with a stopwatch, and they'd measure hundreds of elements. And what we did was we took the averages of those elements. So let's say in North America, somebody stepping off a fork is 1.7 seconds. But in
Right.
Asia, they're maybe a little bit shorter. They're at 1.72 seconds. And in
Mm.
Europe, maybe they're at 1.68 seconds. Well, rather than being extremely precise on that, because 0.2 of a second doesn't really make a difference, we average that out.
Mm.
And we average that out for hundreds of elements inside the business. And then we build up sort of your task. So if you're telling me you're picking a case, I know that there's 31 elements inside of that we add up and say, oh,
Right.
to pick one case is X amount of time. And then we
Mm.
factor into that the type of material handling equipment you're using, speeds, feeds, accelerations, decelerations, and things like that. And most importantly, temperature band. How does
Yeah.
temperature band affect people's performance? Well, obviously, it increases fatigue rate. So
Right.
whether if I'm in a freezer or if I'm working in, say, Thailand in 40 Celsius, that's going to affect how I work.
Yeah.
And so all of that,
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's such a great approach there too because I think, as you're talking there, I mean, and you mentioned the implementations that are, 6, 7 figures and things like that. If we look at the landscape that's out there, really, I mean, there's so many more small and medium-sized businesses, right, where that stuff is inaccessible, really, at certain stages in their growth and their business overall, and maybe the life of their business would never be something that they would be able to implement, right? So being able to create that tool, I think, is a very good thing. So I mean, is that really kind of the target there of trying to help those small to medium sized warehousing businesses, 3PLs, be able to get a harness on this data?
yes, and it essentially is our plan and our strategy is not to go
Hmm.
after the top 2% of the companies where I've been playing for the
Mm.
last 25 years because I know that they've already implemented systems. It's really that bottom 98%.
Mm.
If in the US we're talking over 500,000 physical warehouses in the US, only 2% of those would have some type of labor, whether it's labor monitoring or our activity monitoring through their WMS or a labor management solution.
Mm.
Uh, you start getting into our emerging markets. Again, I've spent a lot of time over this over the last couple of years looking at how we are going to morph in North America and in Europe to near sourcing, which
Yeah.
means we'll go to southern sourcing. That'll be Mexico. That'll be, down to as far as Brazil. And you cannot sell a solution where you're paying 15 or 20 or $25 per named user
Yeah.
per month when the actual labor cost is $2.50 an hour.
Mm.
So they won't get the value. So what you need to do is build solutions that are built for the emerging markets. But then it's priced for the emerging markets, but the value is anybody that's running an operation pretty much anywhere in the world.
Mm.
And the key piece that we're measuring that no WMS, no system out there, no Excel spreadsheet that's being run by the manager measures, which is the ability to calibrate productivity. And we calibrate productivity kind of the way Google Maps works.
Mm.
So
Okay.
Google Maps says I want to go from New York to Chicago. That's 800 miles. The traffic speed is 70 miles an hour. It's if I go highway 80, that's going to take me 11 hours and 42 minutes.
Mm.
And you make a decision based on, oh, should I take highway 80 or should I go with 95 and go up that way? And one is 11 hours and 42 minutes, the other one's 12 hours and 10 minutes. And neither of those numbers is precise.
Mm.
But
Right.
one's accurate, so you're going to choose accuracy over that to make your management decision. Now, Google Maps uses, say, 4 or 5 elements: speed of the road, the type of vehicle you're in. Our tool uses hundreds of elements to
Right.
manage those 32 touch points of labor inside of the building. And that's really what we built. We have a next generation tool that will sit on top of that. That if I am a organization with multiple warehouses, our
Mhm.
our parent solution or our umbrella solution called Ambassador, you'll be able to then look at all your productivity across all your sites. And then you could look at, let's say I have an operation in New Jersey that does 44 cases an hour and have an
Okay.
operation in California that does 52 cases an hour. Theoretically, you might look and say, well, California is a much better operation because they're doing more cases per hour than the people in New Jersey.
Mhm.
But if you scale it back, which happens a lot of times, the order mix, the size of the building, the type of product they're handling, you could find out that the people in New Jersey are actually running at 78% of the work standard, and the people in California are at 76. So companies,
Interesting.
and they use the term best practices, and consultants and vendors alike use the term best practices.
Mm.
And for the last 20 years, I've been out there talking about there's no such thing as best practices. There's things
Okay.
called optimal practices. What can you afford? What are the resources in your building? Those are limitations that you have, right?
Mhm.
I might have columns in my aisles that I can't do anything about, or I only have four
Right.
doors in my building, right? There's certain things, I have cracks in my floor. I can't implement, automation because I'd have to redo my floor, right?
Mhm.
So there's all kinds of things. So you have to look at the optimal side of things. And optimal also takes into consideration your commercial dealings with your client. Like, what is my service level agreement? Do I have 24 hours or do I have 48 hours or 36 hours? And when we start looking at the pressure of e-commerce on the market, that tends to limit what we can do because I can't shut down a business for
Right.
3 months, implement, a $2 million or $3 million automation program. And
Mhm.
automation is coming. I
Yeah.
guaranteed it's coming, but it's coming slowly. And we still have
Mm.
to survive the next 5 to 7 years using physical labor. And if we don't get ahead of this with our marketplace aging in North America and management, specifically the demographics of management is aging,
Right.
and we
Yeah.
are not doing anything to equip the next generation of warehouse managers, warehouse executives, they are
Mhm.
not going to be an Excel driven
Yeah.
group. They're going to want applications and technology to do it. And
Yeah.
so we're not educating people correctly to run warehouses. Most of the supply chain courses that are coming out there are looking at, we'll call it the mathematics of supply chain, which is in, you know, uh,
Yeah.
order quantities, demand driven replenishment, transportation, and that's great. But at the end of the day, if we don't get product out the door,
Mhm.
we're going to have some problems, and there's going to be growing pains. And so automation doesn't necessarily solve your growing pains. It typically just gets you to the wrong answer faster
Yes,
and
absolutely right.
far more money.
Yeah, without a doubt, and I think it's very interesting, and I love the approach you're taking, and I love that you say, and I read this in the book too as well, where you said, we don't need to be precise, we need to be accurate, right? And I think that's such a great thing to say, because when it comes down to it, and you're talking about automation and still having that human element, precision would tell us, maybe we need 2.3 people to accomplish this task, right? But the reality is like, what's a point three of a person, right? And so we want to make sure that's accurate, right? Because that customer experience is really going to drive whether that business succeeds in the long run or not. But I think it's very interesting too that you pointed out that we're not educating in the right way for the next generation, and I see it. I'm adjunct professor and in supply chain, and I see the kids, and there's not much desire to go into the warehousing side of supply chain, right? Versus, the forecasting, planning, purchasing, all those types of things, or the analytics side of things, is very interesting to them. And like you said, they're not going to want to live off spreadsheets. I mean, they've grown up at this point, tied to smartphones with applications for everything, and they're going to want similar work experiences to what they experience in their personal lives now. So I'm curious, when you look at your experience and you look at all these different operations that you've seen and operations that you're looking at and trying to address problems of. When we look at data within the warehousing sector and warehousing businesses, where do you typically see are some of the biggest gaps within data and understanding that data in a warehousing business?
Where to start? That's the question: is how long's a piece of string? So I mean, every company has their data issues, but if
Mm,
most companies don't have a handle on what we'll call their master data. So
mm,
starting at the location level data and then the SKU level data, which really drives everything. Uh, I've done projects in the past where probably 20% of companies keep accurate data on SKU characteristics, heights, weights, and
mm,
cubes. And so when it comes time to do any planning, they're sort of playing the game of, is it bigger than a bread box? And they're guessing, right? And you can go into warehouses all over the world and they're storing air, right? Or
yeah,
they have product, they don't value the locations themselves. So in other words, closest to the door is a far more valuable location than one at the back of the warehouse in level 5.
right.
But there's nowhere in the company, and you go up there and they see, oh, and the primary location in front of the doors, they've either got boxes or they've got product in there that's got 3 inches of dust on it because they don't want to look at it. And so they
Mm,
don't do these, uh, we'll call it dumps of their data. So if I go into any warehouse on the planet, I'll go in and they'll give me, oh, I've got 5,000 SKUs. But if you go and you take out the zeros, so they don't have inventory of it,
yeah,
or they have inventory, but they haven't had sales on it for 12 months, or they've got both, but they don't have any inventory, or uh, they've got no the SKUs come in, but there's no sales gets. They don't look at the orders. They don't look at these zeros inside of their data. But what if you did an exercise on this, you'd find out that 5,000 SKUs is probably closer to 4,000,
right.
right? So companies are typically running somewhere between 15 and 20% redundant SKUs in their database. When we start looking at order data, companies don't really understand their orders. They know an A
Mm,
SKU, right? I know my top A SKUs. And if I've got 1,000 SKUs and I've got an 80-20 rule in my business, that means 50% of my SKUs represent only 3% of my lines.
yeah.
At the manager level and at the operational level, companies don't look at this granular level of information. So they don't understand, the cost to serve models. So
Mm,
this typically falls in the 3PL market,
yeah.
right? They don't realize that, oh, it's costing me 8 cents a unit to pick an A SKU to an A client, but a C SKU to a C client is costing me $3, but I'm only charging the client, a dollar
Mm,
25 to pick the line item. They don't do these analysis. And the bigger the industry, and what I mean by that is automotive,
mm,
warehousing, or hardware stores, things like that. They carry, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 SKUs in their warehouses, right? So what happens is the more SKUs you have, the bigger the problem you have, because now if I've got a 90-10 rule and something like that, that means
mm,
that, if I've got 50,000 SKUs, 45,000 SKUs never get touched. So
yeah.
the model there is, I don't want to walk by them. I have to
Mm,
find a way to isolate the 5,000 SKUs that are my business. But it's costly from a labor perspective to actually reissue this. But if you look over time, the savings
yeah.
is absolute. So when we look at the data inside of these companies, this is the gap. that
Mm,
there is really no system on the market right now, whether it's a WMS, whether it's some sort of order management system or order profiling, that actually does this. So it's left up to the operator
right.
to do this, and they're not equipped with this. They're not
Mm,
given this. They've never had this instruction. So that starts with our gap. That starts with education. Was how do I look at my data?
yeah. Absolutely, and I think the master data is such a key, and I'll say that I've worked for a company where I came in and they wanted to go from paper picking to ASRS voice picking GDP stations within a couple months, and that was an insane project to say the least. But one of the big problems was they didn't have that harness on their master data. They didn't have the DIMs of all their products, and they had probably 30,000 some SKUs like you're talking about, and that was a huge undertaking. Bringing in extra labor just to get dimensioning on products so that that product could get loaded and get into that automation system. So I mean, it's such a core foundational component, I think, to the operation in any state that it's in. But it's going to become even more important as you mentioned. Automation is coming. I mean, if you want to look at any type of automation solutions, those dimensions, the weight, the understanding of that product, how it can be packaged, how it can be transported, not transported. I mean, is huge. I think when you start to implement those types of things. So, it's very interesting to hear from your perspective and your experience there. I mean, I think foundationally, like that's such at the core of that data. I mean, when we look at these things and we look at some of the solutions that you're putting out there to make these things easier for people, and especially the small and medium sized businesses, which I love that you're coming out with this solution for them. Because when we look at that, you talk about the 2% of these large companies, right, that have these resources to have like a data scientist or have engineers and all these things. But you look at you mentioned a 3PL there. There's a lot of family owned mom and pop kind of 3PLs out there, and they don't necessarily have a industrial engineer on staff. They don't necessarily have a data person on staff, right? I mean, they're trying to figure it out, and sometimes they may not know any better, that like this is something they need to track. So I love that the solution is focusing on that and kind of helping them from that affordability perspective, and being able to tackle some of those things. So tell us a little bit about the warehouse command solution that you guys also have.
So Warehouse Command is essentially our entry level product into the marketplace. It's SaaS
Mm,
based, so it's a monthly fee. Basically, what it does is you put in your 17 fields or 16 fields of mandatory data, order information, things like that, and
mhm.
we use all of our data science. So all of those things that we've just talked about are all embedded inside the software, and it comes back and it calibrates for you in 32 touch points. So touch points could be the different types of receiving, right? Am I receiving a full pallet? Am I receiving a pallet with more than one SKU on it? Am I receiving, some sort of containerized product where I have to destuff the container? Each one of these have different standards or KPIs to them. And what we do is we calibrate these KPIs for them based on whatever they are. Our warehouse command product is simple, easy to use. It's in 18 languages. Uh, and from a cost perspective, it's available to any warehouse, any consultant, any vendor selling into the market, and it's a $49 a month subscription. So
Nice.
looking at where we are in the market, I mean the entry point for an LMS is about $50,000.
Yeah.
So that's eliminating our 98%. The $49 a month is essentially incorporating every single organization on the planet.
Mm,
Warehouse Command will extend uh, in the coming months as we start to add more, and I'll call it AI driven solutions. So now I'm going to look and say, oh, your current picking rate is X. But
Mhm.
the AI will then go back and look and say, oh, your distance between SKUs for the type of product line that you're doing is probably a little too far apart. So if we reduce your distance between SKUs by 7%, so let's say we move it down from 3.6 feet per SKU down to 3.3 feet per SKU, that will then increase your picking rate by 3.2 lines an hour per head count.
Mm.
And this is where the AI will come in. And it's not to replace the consultant, because the consultants are going to be still imperative in the industry to implement solutions. What our
Mm.
solution does is gives you the idea to identify the opportunities inside your building currently. So essentially, Warehouse Command is that tool. It's a calculator, it's a solution that provides you with five key measures. And
Mm.
those key measures then will allow you then to plan your warehouse going forward based on engineered average standards, based on, we'll call it the simple rules of warehousing, types of travel, the types of the building that you've got. And again, we'll talk about, more about uh, the elements inside of that
Mm.
business. What temperature band are you operating in? How big are your SKUs and things like that. That's kind of what our tool does. And then within our operation, again, you can run that multiple projects. So if I'm a 3PL, every single client that I have inside my building is
Mm.
essentially an internal, or we'll call it variable warehouse. So each one
Mm.
has different rules, different plans, and the tool allows you to model them all separately. And then you can use that for quoting on new business based
Yeah.
on what your current productivity rate is. I'm sure you've seen this in the market where the 3PL said, "Well, we had to price this to get the deal."
Yeah.
And they go out there and they find out that they priced it, completely outside of the combines of
Mm.
their system. So in other words, they didn't have the WMS to do it. Their building was too big or too small to handle it. They have too many touches. And of course, they come back and say, well, we're losing money on this. And they go back to their partner and say, oh, I need more money to do this after they've gone out and
Mm.
quoted it. Typically, they'll eat that, and they have that problem going forward. Our model is that you're going to be far more accurate using our
Mm.
engineered science. And you could say, there's no sense quoting a contract where I have to work at 85% of the work standard if every other
Yeah.
contract I have in my building, I'm running at 77 or 78.
Mm. Yeah.
Right. So you're just going to lose money on that. So the tool allows you to do that. Our
Mm.
early adopters, companies that were first into our application, were companies that were selling automation, and the
Mm.
consultants themselves going in and doing this for their clients. So we've
Oh,
seen
interesting.
a very fast adoption by the vendors into the market as well as the operators.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's such a great thing. And I mean, at that price point, I mean, $49 a month is like kind of a no brainer in my mind, I think, to be able to get that level of understanding and data visibility and actionable data visibility, which I think is super important. And I'm definitely excited to see how AI comes into play there with the solution as well. I mean, I think you pointed out there something that's pretty, I think, in my eyes, pretty significant from like a data perspective within warehouse operations. Like you mentioned, changing from 3.6 feet to 3.3 feet distance in between picks, right? I think was the example you gave. And I think if you look at it in just that sense, it's like, oh, zero point 0.3 feet, like what difference is that going to make, right? And then when you start to look at it, and you do the math and you extrapolate it out, and you do some examples of this in the book, which I think is really interesting to give that perspective, is it ends up being thousands of dollars saved a month or thousands of dollars saved a year. I mean, it's pretty incredible when we look at just the volume metrics of how many times we're doing these tasks repetitively, and how much 2.3 feet can add up. If you're talking picking, I mean, not only in a month, but in a day, even, or in a week, right? I mean, how much time that can actually save, and then translate that to labor cost is such a huge thing. So it'd be really interesting to see how the AI comes into play with warehouse command as well, and gives those kind of actionable insights, which I think is a great thing too. Because even as we go back to, you're talking about the education of the next generation of warehouse managers, and who are they going to be, what are they going to know, and all these things. I mean, even if you look now at a warehouse manager, I know I've worked with several and had some that have worked for me, and you know data analysis is not necessarily always their strong suit, right? So being able to give them the tools to understand the data better, and then make actionable decisions based on that data, I think is such a key thing, and very, very important. So we've touched on kind of everything about embassy data logistics here, and some of your experience, and gaps in data out there for people to keep top of mind. And we talked a little bit about education as well, which I think is really important to you, and to the industry too. So tell us a little bit before we wrap up here. Tell us kind of a little bit about your book, Warehouse 101, which is all about education for the warehouse, right?
Yeah. So Warehouse 101, essentially, I again, I always spent too much time and of the customer's money educating their people.
Mm,
Uh, and I can remember being brought, so at the, we'll call it the high, not the high side, but the high side of spend. A client flew me to Asia to train
mhm,
25 people on the basics of warehousing. So
mm,
they had a lot of warehouses. I did a 3-day training session on the basics of warehousing that could have been covered if they'd spent, and had some sort of resource material just to read.
yeah,
Uh, that was probably, if you take a look at my travel costs alone and then the 25 people in the room for 3 days, that probably cost them $20,000.
yeah,
Most companies can't afford that. A warehouse manager is the ultimate firefighter.
hmm,
All they're doing is putting out fires every day. They don't have time to take 3 or 4 or 5 hours for 3 days to learn. So building something that's a resource that they could use, and especially for the next generation,
mm,
that they're ill-equipped, they're learning by fire, and they still, as you said, they don't have the basic understanding of the science of warehousing. So when I wrote this book, I guess I used pretty much everything that I've been teaching and learning over the last 25 years. And every experience, everywhere else I go into, I still learn every single day. The minute we stop learning, the minute we're dead. And even
yeah,
in the preamble of the book, I say this is not for your consultant that's been doing consulting for 30 years. The book
hmm,
is designed to be that entry level understanding. There's a glossary of terms in there that's probably 70 pages long. So that if somebody comes in and says, what's an ASRS? You've referred to it in our conversation. Not
yeah,
everybody knows what an ASRS is, right?
hmm,
People sure don't know what distance between SKUs mean. And when you talk about travel in a warehouse, people don't understand the difference between direct travel and perambulation. And these are
mm,
things that are basically the foundation of the science of warehousing. So the book is really the entry level to the science. There's things about how do I choose storage mediums? How do I match storage mediums with my SKUs? Like these are things that if I sat in a room with a guy who's been running a warehouse for 20 years, he still wouldn't know how we get these decisions. So the idea was the book is designed for anybody that's coming into the industry that's been promoted inside of their
mm,
business from a picker to a lead to the warehouse manager, and to really get a handle to make things functionally better, because we're always asked, it doesn't matter where we are in business, to do something better, faster, smarter.
mm,
I mean, that's
yeah.
really what's happening inside of our industry, is that the pressure is really on the warehouse to be faster and smarter and do it cheaper, but we're not giving you any resources. Just do it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's a lot of sometimes that trial by fire in a sense, right? So I mean, it's great to have that type of resource, and I've dug into the book a little bit, and I think it's very interesting, and like you said, I mean, it is such very focused on educating that warehouse supervisor, that warehouse manager, or that soon to be or in the pipeline leader within an operation, which I think is such a great thing to focus on because there needs to be some of that foundational knowledge in there, which can really help them succeed and make better decisions. I think in the operation overall. So very interesting to talk to you here, Lee, and absorb some of your knowledge over all your different experiences here and learn more about embassy data logistics and your book Warehouse 101 as well. So if people are interested to learn more about embassy data logistics or find your book, what's the best way to do that?
Uh, well, you can get the look for the book on Amazon. As they're distributing it worldwide. And Embassy is Embassy Data Logistics, so embassydl.com.
All right, awesome. And we'll definitely put all those links and information at thenewwarehouse.com as well so people can easily find it. So, Lee, thank you once again for joining me on the show today.
Kevin, it was great. Thank you so much.